One of the good stories in that book about siege mentality that I got from Tony Pulis, who was brilliant. When he was Stoke manager in the first couple of seasons, there was plenty of newspaper clippings that he could use in team meetings to say, no one gives you a chance, a bit of reverse psychology, a bit of siege mentality. And then he said to me, we got to the third season and we'd finished halfway up the Premier League. So there were no longer those types of articles. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, I just used to make it up.
Hello and welcome to Outlines, a podcast about sport, stories and the media. My name's Owen Connolly, hope you're well. It is great to have you listening. Now, assuming you're not actually the one writing the stories, there's a lot that goes into navigating the world of modern media. How you shape or ride a narrative, how you put yourself at or away from the centre of things, how you absorb and deflect attention, how you manage relationships and get the right signal to the right audience. That's a complicated thing for anyone in professional sport to consider, but for coaches, it can make an especially critical difference in your chances of success, or at the very least, in keeping your team, your fans, and your employers on the same side. And that's the theme of On the Record and On the Ball, How Elite Coaches Master the Media. It's a book released a few months ago by Tim Percival, who's the communications lead for the England rugby team, and it's just been deservedly nominated in the Charles Terrett Sportsbook of the Year Awards. Tim spoke to 30 top-tier operators, getting a diverse range of views, including those of former head coaches of England's men's rugby union, football and cricket teams in Eddie Jones, Roy Hodgson and Peter Moores, as well as the likes of Emma Hayes, Zach Brown, Mickey Arthur, Ange Postecoglou and Tony Pulis. And he also spoke to a seasoned crop of journalists and broadcasters to understand the other half of this distinctive dynamic. And I spoke to Tim about what he learned in the process, what coaches are actually controlling through the media, how their personal philosophies and responsibilities shape their strategies, the importance of building better relationships, the challenges of the digital media age, and much more besides. There's some fascinating and eye-opening stuff to come, for sure. Quick note, as ever, if you're enjoying the podcast, do be sure to subscribe, rate and review on your platform of choice. Like and share content you see on social media. Details for those accounts are in the show notes. Any way you can help spread the word will be much appreciated. If for some reason you happen to be giving a press conference about your team's latest performance, you could slip a mention in there. Most of you probably will have more conventional means of letting others know about the pod. And it'd be great if you can. If you want to get involved as well, please do get in touch. Always happy to hear from people. But that's enough of that. Enough messaging from me. Let's hear how the bosses do it. Here is Tim Percival. So how have you found being an award-nominated author? That's pretty fun.
Oh, and I'm so chuffed, to be honest. Like, when I set out to try and write the book, I didn't have the first idea how to write a book, and I didn't really know what I was doing, which I doubt is that unusual for some people, but I really didn't know. And then there were times when halfway through, I was just staring at the screen, just thinking, what on earth am I doing? And I don't know how this is ever going to get finished. And then when I got a knock on the door and they were arrived, and I took, and they arrived in a box, and I took one out of the box and looked at it for the first time, I couldn't quite believe I'd done it, really. And the sense of kind of, pride in myself, which sounds, terrible really, but it's such a satisfying thing. And then when I got that shortlist, I found out a couple of weeks ago that I was shortlisted. I was absolutely over the moon because, you set off to try and all I did was set off to try and do it, but I didn't realise it would be recognised as something that's half decent.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. That's a nice, honest kind of human response, Tim. It would have been very easy for you, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the kind of control of message and stuff, but it would have been very easy to kind of go, oh, well, it's not the reason you do these things. But it is nice to be recognised, right?
Yeah.
The genesis of the project itself. I mean, you're not a journalist. Obviously, you've worked in media on the kind of the poacher side. Hang on, no, other way around. The gamekeeper side
Yeah.
for a couple of decades. But what was it that kind of inspired you to kind of compile some of this thinking
Um,
around this?
well, there's a couple of reasons, really. So, first off, I just thought it'd be a subject that people would be
Yeah,
interested in, because I think people are intrigued by what's behind the curtain, and the book does, do that. In a sense, it does that. And then the second thing was, you know, very often between coaches and athletes and the media, there's obviously there's a bit of
mm.
friction and there's a bit of tic tac, and I just thought it would be nice to try and bring those two sides together and help them understand each other a bit better and try and bridge the gap. And then lastly, this isn't really a reason why I wrote it, but like one thing I discovered in writing it was that it's a brilliant piece of personal development. Like if you're going to commit to a book about a particular subject, it does kind of sharpen the focus about how well you have to understand, the subject you're writing about. So for that, the reasons I wrote it were because I thought it'd be interesting, but like the kind of additional benefit of it was that it really helped me understand my subject a bit better as
Yeah.
well.
Because what was your feeling going in? Like, how central are some of these themes to your day to day? Because you're in a comms role that I think for people outside the sports industry, it'll be one they kind of recognize and have a sense of. You're working around a national team. You're facilitating and intermediating and doing all the other things that people maybe would kind of casually think of what PR and comms is about. But did you think you kind of had a handle on this stuff, and then you thought, actually there's more that I didn't understand, or more approaches I hadn't really thought about here? Or
Yeah, I mean, I definitely learned stuff as I wrote it, as I say, because nothing really focuses your mind unless you're going to kind of commit it to a page of, So I definitely learned stuff. And then one of the things that I found challenging is that I wanted the kind of coaches that I interviewed, 30 really top tier coaches that I interviewed, I wanted to make them to make the points for me, because there was stuff I kind of knew, but I needed someone else rather than just me blathering on about stuff. I needed coaches to make those points for me. And the way I did that was kind of, in the interview to, ask them about things and ask them leading questions about stuff and give my opinion and then ask them if they agreed and that type of stuff. But I definitely don't know it all, and I'm kind of learning every day, which I know is a bit of a
yeah,
cliche. But like as I say, I've laboured this point. But when you try and commit something to a page, it doesn't half, sharpen how you understand
yeah.
something.
And also, I suppose in this context in particular, like the roles you've worked in and your role in rugby is gonna have a specific kind of set of dynamics around it, and the media is
Yeah,
going to behave in a certain way, and the players are going to be expected to behave in a certain way and communicate in a certain way that's not going to be consistent with lots of other sports, whether because there's more players
yeah,
on a rugby team and the coaches have more people around them and kind of less autonomy. They're more kind of managers of people. And, the culture around the sport is different, and the culture around the media is different. And there will be sports where the gap between the media and the principles is really wide, and there'll be somewhere it's kind of gossamer thin, which is something you go into about sort of the value of media being different in to these different sports as well. But on that point of the interviews that you did, what were your ambitions for that beyond it being, you wanted top tier practitioners? What was the set of experiences that you kind of wanted to reflect there?
the coaches that I approached, I knew would, by and large, were all really good media operators, and that was the reason why I tried to talk to them, because I knew that they understood their subject well, they understood the media well, and they were kind of thoughtful and thought about that aspect of their job probably a bit more than a lot of coaches do. And it didn't really matter whether it was, an England football coach like Roy Hodgson, who I spoke to, or someone who was from a sport that has less eyeballs on it, less media eyeballs, certainly, because ultimately the discipline is still the same. The interactions for a Premier League football coach will be more frequent, but if you're a hockey coach or a netball coach and you have less contact with the media, the lessons and the disciplines and that you can impart from those people are the same in either sport. So that was useful as well. So yeah, I spoke to everyone from football, rugby, cricket, hockey, women's basketball, as varied amount of sports as possible, so I could get a kind of much more rounded argument.
Yeah. And the reader, I mean, you set this out as well, but you're sort of somewhere between, like, it's an interesting kind of bit of kind of pop business reading for someone who's curious, as you say, about how coaches communicate, and it's a huge kind of, but also that sort of foundational text maybe for someone coming into the business. I mean, how strong do you think this sector is at talking about itself in that way?
Well, not very good in my opinion, because when I first started, so I'm 46, right? So when I first started working in the early 2000s after I graduated, I worked for a kind of fledgling PR and marketing agency, which is now a pretty reasonably sized business. But I was probably fourth or fifth in the door. And sport as an entertainment industry was really starting to boom. So lots of kind of specialist PR and marketing agencies, sponsorship agencies were popping up all over the place. But like, I sat there and there was no textbook or, nothing to teach me the kind of fundamentals of PR and communications. You just kind of learnt it on the job and learnt it from the people who were senior to you. So I'd have given anything for a book out there that lays out the book that I've written. And that was one of the reasons, that's one of the audiences that I think will find that book most useful, is people who are just starting out in that industry, or students of journalism and communications, because it'll help them understand the two sides of the fence a bit better. But honestly, there was nothing really out there, particularly that's specific to sport. And I think that the ones that are PR and comms, broader PR and comms ones, they're a bit boring. Maybe I'm being unfair, but I've certainly never picked one up. There's only one or two books I've ever picked up about that discipline that I find, that are real page turns.
Yeah, I mean, and they kind of tend towards the sort of the gossipier end of the scale, like, my 5 years as a flack doing X, Y, or Z, and that sort of thing, rather than sort of constructive.
Or they're corporate. Yeah, or they're just kind of corporate, texts about. Yeah, certainly within sport, I don't think there's a book like it, and hence one of the reasons. That's probably another driving force of why I wanted to write it.
So when you approached people to talk about this stuff, like, what was the response? Was there an openness? Because, as you say, there's maybe not always that level of reflection on how these things work. Was there an openness to talk about it? What were the attitudes that you discovered?
Well, they varied really. Some. I got an enormous amount of help from an ex-colleague of mine, Eddie Jones, who was, as you know, the England rugby head coach for 7 years. And I worked with him for a few years. And he was the first guy I interviewed, and he helped set me up with a few of the people that I interviewed in the book. Tony Pulis and Roy Hodgson, he set me up with, and Ange Postecoglou. So he was really supportive of me and supportive of the book and helped me. And his introduction to them helped me open the door to some of those guys. And then there are lots of people I asked who said, thanks very much, but it's not for me. It's not a subject they wanted to, kind of be on record about. And then there are some people who were like, yeah, absolutely fine, happy to do it, if you see what I mean. So I had some quite, ambitious, high profile coaches that I wanted to speak to. And I got to some of them, some knocked me back, and some said, yeah, I'm happy to chat. But it's one of those subjects, isn't it, that some people feel more comfortable talking about than others.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think something also we'll kind of unpack as we go. Do you think it helped that you were on, you were coming at it from having been a communications professional rather than being a journalist?
100%. Yeah, 100%. Because I think, and as I say, I had some decent introductions. And one of the things I did do when I started to approach people kind of cold is that I've said, I've already spoken to Eddie Jones and Tony Pulis and Ange Postecoglou. So that kind of put them at ease that they were going to be in quite good company. It wasn't just they were going to be, as I say, in a book full of decent, high profile coaches.
Yeah. Maybe slightly putting your professional day job hat back on. Is there a sort of foundational thing that you put in place with this? If let's say an Eddie Jones comes into your organization, your job is to kind of be to help him kind of develop a strategy in terms of how he's going to deal with the media. I mean, he's probably not the ideal example because he'd done a version of that job before, but you know what I mean? Like someone's coming in saying, okay, what's the territory here, etc. Is there a foundational set of principles that you put into place or a strategy you can design? Or is this such a kind of personal thing, as in built around the personality of whoever the coach is, and also kind of secondary to the performance side or relational to the performance side of what their job is, that you have to start from scratch a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think every coach has their own view on how to approach communications and how to deal with the media, and that's right. And they'll have their own instincts, and so they should. I think that what I hope when I first meet a coach, or if I'm advising someone in that position, is that they take it seriously, because if they don't, the risks are there. So regardless of what their kind of philosophies and beliefs are on how to deal with the media, as long as they are taking it, they are engaging with it, then I think you're on kind of steady ground. And then the second bit to that really is that you can talk a lot about strategy, and people can get caught up in strategy, and strategy is important to a point. But ultimately, the best strategy in communications is trying to connect with people. As long as they are trying to connect with people, like you and I are now, and I suppose I am to your listeners, then again, I think they're pointing in the right direction. Take it seriously, and then try to connect with an audience that you can. If you see what I mean. If you're not engaging, then
Yeah, but what's the kind of order that you put pieces into? Because obviously you'll have conversations initially with whoever that coach is. You'll get a sense of how they communicate, right? And you'll, particularly when it's a really high profile job like a national team coach, you'll have seen them communicate and you'll know what works. And you might have to say, by the way, our press, they'll like that, they might not like that so much, kind of thing. But how much do all the other pieces also fit around it? The time they're going to have is obviously going to be different if it's a job with a high volume of games or a high volume of kind of high pressure events, rather than you might have, like you currently have a bit of time off, but the Six Nations would not have been a time when we could have had this conversation.
No.
Like, how much do all those other bits fit around, and how many people they've got to manage away from the players, and how many people, all that type of stuff?
I mean, as I say, it depends on the profile of the job. You're right. It depends on the profile of the job, because again, if you're a Premier League manager, you're doing a hell of a lot each week. You're doing, pre-match press conference. You could be playing 3 times a week. You're doing all the post-match stuff. It's pretty relentless. And I suppose that when I first again start working with a coach, my approach is just to try and find out how they want me to help them. Where are the areas that they feel like they need some guidance on, and then at the same time, I'm trying and persuade and influence them for the things that I feel strongly about, if you see what I mean. So, as I say, my first conversation is normally to work out where they want me to try and help them. And then I think I'll have made my own assessment and tried to persuade and influence where I think they also need some guidance as well. And as you say, that can be influenced because I keep talking about the Premier League, but it's just the pure volume of games in the Premier League. It's like one after the next, after the next, after the next. You're not always going to get a huge amount of time with a coach like that. But, in different sports, there's a bit more of a kind of runway towards major events. You can have time to set out, and plan a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much does a coach bring their own philosophy? We'll talk a bit about the ways in which you use relationships with the media, or the ways in which you use a media profile to direct narrative, or maybe take a bit of pressure off players, or maybe put a bit of pressure on players. But, there will be coaches who'll come in who will say, I have a really specific set of ideas about how I do that, but maybe I have to change it for this job. And there'll be coaches who maybe will stick to their principles and either find that it works or find to their cost that it doesn't. But again, how does that shape the approach that people take? And you can kind of address that from personal experience, but also the conversations that you had putting the book together.
Well, if I give you an example of, say, Eddie Jones when he first came into the England job in end of 2015, I started with him. I came in with Eddie, and in one of our first meetings, he said, look, the thing with the media is we just got to be good at it. Right? That was his approach. Like, we just got to be good at dealing with it. And of course, you will know how much you are of a rugby fan, but you'll have seen some of his press conferences, and they're absolutely masterful at times. They're brilliant in terms of some of the tactics and strategies that he used around distraction and mind games and all of that stuff. They're great fun to be part of. You could sit there and be like, this is great, and this guy understands what's going on here and has got a pretty good grip on it. And there are times where he didn't get it right, for whatever reason. And I think your job, as I say, and I feel like I'm going to repeat myself a bit, and I apologize for that, but like your job is really to try and persuade and influence where you think they can make improvements. And you only do that by, showing that you're already competent and having, their trust, which takes time to build up, because, you're very often you're starting those relationships from scratch. But they know that you've got their best interests at heart, and, you're doing your best to kind of help them. And of course, very often, they need your help the most when things are, you have a bad set of results, or or you have a poor run of form.
Yeah. One of the things that you spend a bit of time talking about, most people's conception of how this works is well-timed soundbite in a press conference, or control of emotion after a game that's gone one way or another, or what have you, the kind of public-facing stuff. But what's the balance for coaches between the communication you can see, that kind of stuff, and what you can't see, the relationship building or the internal culture that you set for players, the expectation that they might have about what their relationships are going to be, the difficult choices you might have to make around a challenging story, say?
Well, they're two sides of the same coin. So there's the visible bit, the bit you can see when you flick a coin and it lands. The bit you can see is the top half of the coin, which is the bit you see on telly, or you read in the newspaper, or you listen to on a radio, or you see a piece of content, so on and so forth. That's the visible bit. And then the underside of the coin is the kind of non-visible bit, which is media relations, almost, and about how you build relationships with various media outlets and journalists, for the kind of strategic benefits that you want from building those relationships. Hopefully that doesn't sound nebulous, but and the reason you build those relationships is, there are a few reasons, but it's about helping shape the narrative. In many cases, it's about understanding the kind of media's point of view. It's about driving publicity. There are lots of reasons why you build those relationships, but I think fundamentally it builds down to. And I'm not saying you have to kind of be on first, like kind of speed dial with every, journalist on the beat. You should. I think you should have a kind of decent arm's length relationship with some key media that are in your sphere. And the reason, I think one of the reasons you do that is that, it's about goodwill, isn't it? If someone, it's human nature. If someone likes you, they're more likely to, write in a more balanced way if times are tough, and they're more likely to try and understand your methods a bit more when things are a bit sticky. That's one of the reasons why you should build relationships, and that's like any relationship in life, isn't it? Relationships are like flowers. You have to kind of tend them and help them grow and all the rest of it. And I think that's the same with coaches and athletes. Is that I think a few of them have decent professional relationships with the media, and I think that helps them, as I say, in various strategic ways. And that's the bit, as I say, that's the bit of the coin that you kind of don't see. I think to the general public, you see the bit which is, on Sky Sports or TNT or on the BBC or ITV or whatever. That's the bit that they see. But there's a hell of a lot goes on beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess we're getting into a kind of deeper point, which is what are the limits? What are you controlling for, basically? Because the one thing you can't do anything about in your media strategy, at least, is how your performances go. But are you kind of... Is that process about getting a fair hearing, as you say, and making sure that, people aren't out to get you, basically, that they're going to approach you fairly and they're going to trust what you say? Or is it also about highlighting the things that you want to be seen? So you might lose a game if you're the coach, but if people trust you and trust your judgment through what they hear from you in the media, they'll say, well, there was a plan there, and they were outmatched on the day, or the bounce of the ball went the wrong way, or what have you. It's not a question of what the coach is or isn't doing. I mean, what are you controlling for, really, with that?
Well, I'll give you an example, right? So one of the guys I spoke to is Mickey Arthur, who was, and he's Derbyshire cricket coach at the moment, but he's coached Australia, Pakistan, South Africa. He's a legendary kind of test cricket coach, and a really lovely bloke. And he said that whenever he takes a job, he'll take in, a few key relationships with the media, and he will basically brief them about where he's going to go from point A to point B. This is the plan. This is what we're going to do. And the reason why he does that, and he told me this, the reason why he does that is that he can kind of say to them, look, this is what I'm setting out to do. This is how we're going to get there. It might not be kind of linear, but they are then furnished with what the plan is, hopefully what the outcome is, and how they're going to get there and how he's going to go about it. So that when, he's in, media conferences with some of those writers, they kind of understand the journey that they're on, and they're on that kind of journey. They understand the journey because they've been told in private. And I think that's quite a good way of doing it, because there are always bumps in the road in coaches, cycles and tenures. But he feels that if they are, if they are furnished with, what the strategy is and what the plan is, then, along the way there will be, I don't know, more understanding, maybe more sympathetic, more balanced. If there are bumps in the roads, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, are there? I mean, obviously there are going to be limits to how open a coach or manager is going to be about whether it's on-field strategy or whether it's how they handle things internally. But you're kind of setting a tone and a direction. I guess the counterbalance to that is, you're then creating the framework by which you're going to be judged, right? These are the terms that you're going to be evaluated against. If you say you come into a football club these are my expectations, these are my standards, or you say, I want to play football in a certain way, and then you don't do it. Like you
Yeah.
immediately kind of create, what am I trying to say here? You immediately create
Well,
this.
you're not managing expectation
Yeah.
very well, are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, and I suppose it's a judgment call for that coach as how explicit they want to be about what the plan is, because some coaches will say, and it's normally the first press conference where they're introduced to the supporters or they're introduced as the new person. This is the plan and this is how we're going to get there. And some, coaches are bold enough to set that out. I mean, if you think of someone like, say, Jurgen Klopp, who,
Mm.
is a masterful communicator, in my opinion. I mean, just a brilliant, brilliant communicator. He talked about heavy metal football, didn't he?
Yeah.
And that simile metaphor, can't remember which one. That's such a kind of clever use of language because it paints a picture as to how he wanted Liverpool to play. And you're right, that does put you on the hook, but it also connects you with your supporter base to say, look, this is how we're going to play, and I can sum it up in three words to you: heavy metal football. And that's what makes him such a brilliant communicator, because he's got really good, clever use of language and a good linguist, isn't he? Despite the fact that he's obviously speaking his second language.
I mean, there's a couple others I'm thinking of. Mourinho is the famous one where he comes in and immediately makes himself the story for the next kind of however long he was at Chelsea the first time, and he calls himself a special one, which is very much how he, for good and bad, communicates with the media. He absorbs all of the interest, and that means that when things start to go wrong, he quickly makes himself vulnerable. But it meant he got a lot of trust internally, as well as kind of people outside, particularly when he was winning stuff, being like, well, whatever strange thing he does or whatever fight he picks or whatever, there's always kind of a destination in mind. And then there's two others I'm thinking of, both recent Arsenal managers. Emery, bless him, didn't have great English when he first came to Arsenal, and I think he used the word protagonist in his first press conference. And people then had expectations about a certain style of play that he didn't deliver, because that's not really his style. He's more of a kind of counter-attacking coach. Whereas Arteta came in and said, I'm going to expect X, Y, Z out of my players. And that the kind of fluency and confidence of that first press conference probably got him through quite a long, difficult period of resetting and, establishing new expectations.
Yeah, I think with Arteta, one of the things, and I actually talk about this in the book, one of the things that helps Arteta is the All or Nothing documentary on Amazon, because he didn't have a great first season, if you remember. I mean, he's been consistently right up there since. I think he's a wonderful manager, by the way. And I liked that he kind of sets the tone. But his first season, if you remember, he had the Arsenal documentary. That's his first, that's his first year as a manager of a top club, because he'd been an assistant coach prior to that. That is not easy if you've got a documentary crew following you around, catching, trying to catch your every word. But actually, once that was released, I think that went a long way towards helping Arteta ingratiate himself with the Arsenal fan base, because they could see how passionate he was and they could see what he stood for in that documentary. And I think, it showed you behind the curtain what type of character he was. And I think that massively, massively helped him.
Yeah. On that point, because I don't want to dwell too much on Arsenal this week of all weeks, but on that point of these sort of newer forms of media, how much is not just the kind of immediacy of social media, but also the diversification and the sort of dissipation of the message across multiple different platforms? How has that changed this job? Because it used to be like, I'll come in to this press conference, I'm thinking about the back page, I'm thinking about what my players hear, and I'm thinking about what's going to be the kind of the big story that comes out of this. Whereas now things can get clipped up in any of 100 ways, and you've got lots of different audiences who are going to be interested in what you have to say. Not all of them,
Yeah.
It's not all going to get received in the same way, and then that filters. There's a process by which a story can kind of filter out and then be received by these different groups of fans, in particular, in different ways, and then filter back to the people who are writing the stories and kind of setting the tone of coverage. Like, what's that done? How do you approach that, first of all?
So owned channels, they're so important for clubs nowadays, aren't they? But one of the things that own channels, let's take, I don't know, an Instagram channel, for instance, it's the whole thing is curated, isn't it? So you can control the message. Yeah, the advantages are obvious, right? You can control the message. You have a consistency of tone, and you kind of reduce the kind of external distortion of stuff. So you can see why, and it gives you a direct line, without the filter of the traditional media into your supporter base. And that's great, right? But where you have to be careful is that they don't slip into it looking like propaganda. And that's where you just have to get that kind of balance right between it being, between getting good messages out there, controlling those messages, giving you a kind of glimpse behind the scenes, giving the content they couldn't get anywhere else. But I think when it verges into kind of
Pravda,
then you just have to be a little bit careful. And one of the advantages, this is the one thing, just on the, talking about the difference between content and, kind of news management, is that, the great advantages of content is, say if you're on a really bad run of form, take Tottenham, for example, who are obviously not doing brilliant at the moment. You can just turn it off, because that if you put stuff up, there's going to be a hostile reception to some of the content, but you can just turn it off. Whereas the thing with news management and dealing with the kind of, traditional media is that you can't turn that off. You have obligations through the terms of participation in the Premier League, for example, that you've got to have a news, you've got to have a press conference, and you've got to have X amount of players afterwards, and et cetera, et cetera. And I always think that that's, in many ways, it's such a nice, for the people who work within that industry, it's just great because, as I say, you can just turn it off like a tap, if you see what I mean. But, with media and the obligations you have through participation agreements with the Premier League and World Cups and so on and so forth, you just got to keep fronting up type thing. And that's such a, it's a real luxury, I think, if you work that side. Whereas with the traditional media, you kind of always, with news management and communications, you're kind of always on. Hopefully that makes sense.
What's there's a couple of interesting dynamics around that. One of which is, whereas we talk about athletes in sports media being digital native, or sort of having learned the rhythms and the way that social media works, they may or may not spend a lot of time on there, but they kind of they're more fluent in the language of it than a head coach who might be 50, 60 years old. Is that an asset, or is that to the detriment of head coaches? Because again, when you're in that position, you are a figurehead and you're setting big picture communications terms, right? So, is it helpful to not be in the weeds and thinking about, well, how is this going to get chopped up, as getting into a sort of cycle of the sort of feedback loop that you can get into and in social media led stories? Or does it sometimes lead them down blind alleys? What do you think about how that's changed the picture?
I think most coaches can kind of adapt, even though you're right, most coaches are often a generation or two older than the people they coach. And that can certainly influence their communication style, because they'll have picked up habits and so on and so forth. I think the best communicators and the best coaches evolve with the media landscape. You don't expect, every coach to understand the kind of, the latest thing within social media and the latest app or the nuance changes to the way things are presented. But I think the best communicators have got a good understanding of how, you know, what that social media or traditional media landscape looks like at the time, and they kind of adapt with it and evolve and understand its importance.
Does that fit a little bit with how coaches have to think and talk anyway? You have settings where you're going to have very detailed, kind of detail-rich conversations about strategy or about a particular game plan or about how you're going to manage a workload or whatever. You might have an hour-long conversation with a player. You might have a 2-hour meeting with your team where you're going over video analysis. But you might also have to get a message across in 30 seconds or less to sort of really land something that's going to be important when that player is tired and when their blood's up and all the rest of it. Does that sort of translate quite well sometimes to the different wavelengths that a media message is going to be read on?
Yeah, I just think one of the most important tools that a coach has got is how they communicate. And there are lots of different audiences, aren't there? It's how you communicate with your externally, with your supporters and your employers. You know, there's those kind of external audiences, but it's also internally, isn't it, with the people who work for you and the people who, you know, you're coaching. And I think that, as I say, it's such an important tool. If you've only got, you know, a minute at half time to get your kind of message across, or you've got, you know, the start of a week when you're setting out a theme for, you know, a football match on Saturday, to get that message right that lands, you know, is so important. And I think an enormous amount of time and energy goes into that. Because, as I say, you know, as I said to you earlier, you know, communicating is about connecting with people. What you're trying to do is connect and sell a message, whether it's at halftime or at start of the week or post-match when you're talking to, you know, supporters or, you know, your employers. You know, or potentially, you know, there are other audiences, aren't there? You know, you can talk to, you know, if you're brave enough, you can talk to referees, you can talk to the game's administrators. You know, you're always trying to kind of sell and persuade and influence. And I think that's just such an important bit of a coach's job.
Yeah. Just one more thing on this sort of the evolution of the media landscape. I mean, there's a couple of strategies that were very prevalent in the tabloid era that I just wonder how they translated today. One being the more antagonistic sort of siege mentality relationship, you know, expertly done by some. Alex Ferguson from time to time being an example that you use in the book. Another example that you use in the book who did it well sometimes, did it very badly on one occasion, is Joe effing Kinnear. I think you bring up his introductory press conference at Newcastle where he decided to take on the entire local media at once. And then there's also the sort of withdrawal, just saying, I will do, you know, I'll do whatever I'm contractually obligated to do, but I will otherwise be a mystery and I'll let the results do the talking for me. Are either of those really options in the same way as they used to be? Or is the fact that media is so much more participative now, does that make it that you can't do that? Or do you just have to do it in a slightly different way?
Well, if you take, you know, siege mentality as an example, you can definitely still create a siege mentality. And I think coaches, if a coach thinks that's the right approach and that they think that's going to get the best out of their team or their squad, then you can definitely still do that. But, and this is something that I think Jeremy Snape, the former England cricketer, who's now a sports performance psychologist, told me, is that there's a kind of shelf life to siege mentality. You can't permanently do it. You know, it can only last, you know, for a certain period of time. You can't just keep saying the world's against you. And I think there, you know, he talks about that there are some disadvantages to trying to say that the world is against you all the time, because you end up just being a bit kind of paranoid. And but so I think you can definitely do it. I mean, one of the good stories in that book about siege mentality that I got from Tony Pulis, who was brilliant, I mean, I really underestimated him, and to my shame, because he was a really kind of interesting and had a really unorthodox and interesting way of thinking about media. He told me a story about when he was Stoke manager in the first couple of seasons. They weren't, there was plenty of newspaper clippings and plenty of media coverage that he could use in team meetings to say, look, no one gives you a chance, a bit of reverse psychology, a bit of siege mentality. They don't rate you. They don't respect you. They think you're rubbish, etc., etc. And then he said to me, we got to the third season and we'd finished, halfway up the Premier League. So there were no longer those types of articles that I could kind of use to try and galvanise my squad into the third season because it had worked. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, I just used to make it up. So he'd walk into the changing room and he would say, did you hear what they said about you? And this is what they said on TalkSport. This is what they said on Sky Sports News. And no one gives you a chance. They think you're rubbish and blah, blah, blah. And none of it was true, but he was still trying to create that kind of siege mentality. To answer the second bit of part of your question,
are people able to just withdraw? The second bit.
I mean, they can do what's kind of contractually obligated to them and no more, and that's fine, But I don't, I would argue that, I'm not saying you have to do every kind of media interview that you requested. Otherwise, some coaches would be here until Christmas doing stuff, but I don't think that helps in kind of relationship building. And I certainly don't think it helps in getting your kind of message out if you're just doing, kind of press conferences. Because I think some coaches are more persuasive and in kind of long format interviews, like a podcast or whatever. So yeah, you can do that approach, but I don't think it's necessarily the right one most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, people talk in politics, don't they, about there's now a danger of the vacuum if you just do the minimum or just kind of try and stay back.
Yeah. Because someone will fill that space for you.
Yeah. What were some of the stories or some of the approaches that you encountered that really surprised you in this book?
Well, Tony was one. I had a kind of preconception of Tony Pulis before I spoke to him, and Eddie Jones, who put me in contact with him, said, oh, he's great, he's a good thinker and he's an interesting person and, you'll enjoy speaking to him. And there was just so much, I just knew from, I had half an hour on the phone with him. I just knew that from the moment he started talking, I just thought he would kind of challenge my thinking, and he just gave me lots of different stories. I mean, the one thing that he told me that, and I verified this with a friend of mine who works at The Athletic, is he always used to stand in press conferences. He would always used to stand and he wouldn't want to sit down. And I asked him why, and he just said, I just didn't like the idea of people looking over me. I wanted to almost be kind of on a level with them. So he'd always have press conferences where he stood. And he told me that story about siege mentality. I asked him if he ever, kept an eye on the news and was aware of what was out there, because I think it's important for coaches to do that, because you need a barometer of what the feeling is amongst the media and the fans. And he said, no, but I made sure that my assistant coaches were across it and that they would flag anything to me that they thought, kind of overstepped the mark. So he had that kind of filter to say, his a couple of assistant coaches would flag stuff with him. There were just lots of little different bits about him. I mean, the one that the second chapter is about controversy and crisis, right? And I use a quote that he gave me at the start of that. And he basically just says, what I realized as a young manager is that you're always in the shit. You're either ankle deep, knee deep, or up to your neck in it, kind of thing. And I just thought, yeah, he's right. You as a coach, you're never ever plain sailing, are you? Look at Arteta. He's been Arsenal have been top of the league for 200 odd weeks, isn't it, or something? Not 200 odd days or whatever. And Man City have been top of the league for something like, I saw a stat the other day, like 3 or 4 days or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But all of a sudden,
Yeah.
so yeah, he was brilliant and he really surprised me.
Yeah. Couple more quick bits. I mean, is there someone who, either someone you spoke to, or it could be someone who is working today, but someone who stands out in this area to you as a particularly effective communicator?
Yeah, I mean Klopp, and I know I've talked about him. Klopp, and probably Southgate.
Different approaches.
Yeah, Jurgen Klopp, because I just thought he just connected with people, and I know I've laboured that point, but he was just brilliant. So I won't talk any more about him. I mean, one of the reasons why I like Southgate is that I think Southgate connected with people as well. I think he's articulate and erudite man, and obviously thought about that area a lot, that area of his role and how important what it is with it.
Yeah.
But actually, one of the things that I admired about him is that he, unlike many coaches, particularly national coaches across the world, he would talk about societal issues, whether it's about race or whatever. And I think that's pretty brave. Most coaches don't go there for obvious reasons, but I really admire him for that. I really respect him for that because he was prepared to go there. And actually, now he's not coaching England anymore. He's still kind of campaigning for young men and role models and speaks on those subjects, and he gives some lectures on it, speaks about it in his book. I just think that's really admirable and, flies in the face of the stick to football stuff,
Yeah.
which I don't agree with. So, yeah, I just credit to him for using his voice in that way.
Yeah. And just one last thing on the book and on this this kind of sector of media and communication. Like, what do you think? We've talked about some of the ways in which things have changed. What do you think are some of the things that people are going to have to be aware of in the next few years?
Well, two things from the media side of two on the media side of things, but I think clubs and teams and athletes are just going to have to get used that there's more access. So at the moment, there are kind of cameras everywhere, and the media want to film halftime talks and halftime pictures and in the tunnel and
heart rate monitors.
Spider cam comes over in the middle of the Ashes test, and all of that stuff. I think there's just going to be more and more of that, and more inventive ways to try and cover sport. TV/tech companies who are going to be the rights holders for this stuff pay a lot of money for that, and they want to give viewers something new and something innovative. And I just think there will just be new and innovative ways of trying to cover it, which involves, broadcast cameras and access. So I think that's just going to get more and more creative, and that will be a challenge for teams and clubs and federations. And then the second thing is, and I'm going to do my best to try and explain this, but I think some journalists will become kind of sports news fluencers, which is such a rubbish term. Like can't think of any other way to describe
workshop it for a bit.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is that in the kind of content economy, you'll get journalists who have probably got more reach than the media outlets that they work for because of their large following on social media, particularly the way that algorithms work on social media, where with individuals against organizations. So I think you'll get to a stage where some journalists will be, and I think we're there on with some.
Yeah, I mean, you see it a bit in the US, don't you?
Yeah,
you see it a bit with Stephen A. Smith and people like that.
And I can't recall his name, but the Italian journalist who got heavily criticised the other week for sharing kind of Saudi propaganda.
Yeah.
But
transfer journalist.
Yeah, he does football transfers, and arguably is a much bigger reach than traditional media. And I think that traditional media outlets may invest in their journalists a bit more in that, but obviously the risk is that they then they lose that audience if the journalist goes somewhere else or decides to work for somewhere else. So yeah, hopefully that wasn't garbled, but that's one of the things that I think we'll start to see.
Yeah, so kind of more of a not antagonistic, but more kind of personalities than
Yeah, personality
institutions
led
kind of.
newsfluencer.
Okay. That could be the next book.
Yeah.
Three questions that we ask everyone before we let them go. The first is, do you have an origin story or something that sparked your own interest in sport?
Yeah, so my dad was a teacher and a school chaplain at a private school. So my back kind of garden was just the school playing fields. So as a result, I had kind of football, rugby, and cricket nets like on tap and people to play with. So the reason I started playing sport myself, and I played rugby and cricket, and I played cricket to a reasonable level, was that my kind of out my back door were sports fields and people to play with.
Yeah.
From when I was knee high to a grasshopper. So that's why I love sport and stayed with me.
Yeah. What's your favorite piece of sports storytelling?
I think it's Senna, the documentary
Okay,
Senna,
yeah.
who 2010 documentary about Ayrton Senna, the Brazilian F1 driver. And incidentally, I met the guy who produced that, James Gay Rees, who's behind Box to Box, who do the Drive to Survive series on Netflix. And I hadn't realised that when I watched it at the time, but obviously our paths crossed a couple of years ago. I got a chance to talk to him about it. Just brilliant. I'm in awe of that film. And the reason why that film is so brilliant is that the way it's put together, it's stitched together. So there's no narrator or kind of talking head. The whole thing is just stitched together with archive interviews, in-car radio dialogue, every single different bit of kind of archive audio that they could find. And then they just sewed it together. So it just kind of runs like a tapestry all the way through from start to finish and tells that guy's incredible life, tragic life, with a tragic ending, I suppose. And it's just the most brilliant, perfect piece of storytelling I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. It is remarkable. I think Matthew Barrett, who's our last guest, was talking about that style of filmmaking, that sort of everything very immediate and using footage in a way that's not kind of it doesn't feel constructed. It feels sort of like you say, a tapestry. It's kind of it all whirls together.
Yeah.
What is you first book done? What's a sports story you'd like to tell or see someone else tell?
So I was thinking about this because I know that you always ask these three questions to your guests. So this is the one I had to give some decent amount of thought to. And I landed on Viber Suryavanshi, who is the 15-year-old cricket player for Rajasthan Royals at the moment. And so for anyone who doesn't follow cricket in the IPL, this is a lad who's been playing in the IPL at 14 and he's now 50. And he is dominating the IPL as an opening batsman. He's a left-hander. He is the most prodigious talent I think I've ever seen in my life. You talk about, brilliant young tennis players and footballers and so on. This kid is 14. He is absolutely remarkable. Like, smacking the best bowlers in the world to all parts in the IPL.
Yeah, it's like they're the 15-year-olds
and
he's
insane.
A grown man. Yeah.
And I can't get my head around it. And I can't think of a more prodigious talent than him right now. Or, someone will, correct me, Nadia Comaneci, the gymnast who did the first perfect 10. I'm sure there'll be someone on a par with someone like him, but he's got to be up there in history as just the most remarkable story. And he'll be, he could be playing, cricket for the next, 30 years of my life. And I think he will absolutely dominate Indian cricket. and he kind of, as I say, he's kind of dominating the IPL as it is.
Yeah.
And I think that is an amazing story to tell, and someone should definitely tell it. Not someone like me, someone who's a lot better at writing about cricket than I am, if you see what I mean. But like what a story that guy is.
Yeah, and an amazing lens through which to look at sport and the world and media in you know, some of the ways that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
On the Record and on the Ball is out now. Tim, it has been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Cheers, then.
Outlines is an original production from 2640.